Moving on to the second house. The second house, traditionally speaking, is called Anaphora. And Anaphora means exit from the gates of Hades, which is interesting because the eighth house is called Apocataphora, which means falling into the gates of Hades. The second house and the eighth house are interesting from the perspective of exiting hell at the second house and entering hell in the eighth house, because it's meant to show us that both of these houses exist on the spectrum of death. Within Jyotish, or Indian astrology, which I don't refer to as Vedic astrology because Vedic astrology as a term is a Western term to describe Jyotish. Within Jyotish, there's this idea of the quote-unquote killing houses or the Marka houses. And the second house within Jyotish is thought of as a killing house or a Marka house. The second house is a Marka house. The seventh house is also a killing house because it's in direct opposition to the first house. And the eighth house is thought of as a killing house as well. And we don't see this idea of the second house as a killing house really manifesting in a lot of traditional astrology, but we do find snippets of it within our own traditional Western astrology. And I speak about those in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology. If we push this thought of the second house being a house of death aside, what else does the second house represent? The second house represents our wealth and our financial assets within this lifetime. And technically speaking, the eighth house is also on this spectrum of wealth as well. And the fact that both the second house and the eighth house are these points of Hades says to us that in the same way as the underworld holds all of the mineral resources of our earth, the second house holds all of the liquid resources in the form of money that we use to give ourselves sustenance within this lifetime. Within traditional astrology, the second house is also associated with food. And this is something that we don't speak about a lot, but the second house is associated with money as well as food, because if we apply our concept of the Chaldean order to the 12 houses, we end up with Saturn in the first house, but we end up with Jupiter in the second house. And in the same way as Jupiter is associated with the cornucopia of the fertile fields and abundance and wealth in general, the second house is associated with the warm abundance of our mother's breast milk that we receive within this lifetime after being born into this physical world based on the power of Saturn in our first house. So, once again, we inherit this physical body from Saturn in the first house, and right after we're born, we need to be fed. So the second house is representing the warm sustenance of our mother's breast milk when we first come into the world, and as we grow older and no longer need that, it represents the solid food that we eat to support ourselves within this lifetime. And as we grow even older, that food metaphorically becomes the money that we make and that we earn within this lifetime to support ourselves and to support our needs. So for all of these reasons, the second house has to do with money, but it also has this underlying fact in which it also has to do with food. As far as the planets are concerned, there are some planets that have an analogous relationship to the second house, and there are some planets that don't. From a traditional perspective, the planets that have an analogous relationship with our second house are clearly going to be Jupiter, because Jupiter is a god of wealth and abundance, Venus, because Venus is also a benefic planet, and Mercury, because Mercury is a planet of exchange and commerce and things of a mercantile nature. Our word mercantile is the root of our word marketplace, and Mercury is the root of all of that. So therefore, Mercury is at the root of all things mercantile. Mercury is the god of the marketplaces, and Mercury is also the god of transactional exchanges. Therefore, these planets have a natural relationship or an analogous relationship with the second house: Jupiter, Venus, Mercury. We can also say that the North Node has a natural or an analogous relationship with the second house because the North Node is a node of increase or abundance. The planets that do not have an analogous relationship with the second house are going to be any of the modern planets, of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And I think I should make a statement about Pluto because Pluto is also a god of great wealth and abundance as well. But when we have Pluto physically located within our second house, that can go one of two ways. Pluto can either represent a concrete ceiling that prevents you from ever moving beyond a particular number within your bank account. So, for example, you have $10 in your bank account and you do all sorts of things to increase that and to change that and to diversify your assets. And even if you end up making $100, life comes in once again and takes you right back down to that $10 bill, to the point where it feels as if the gods are making a cosmic joke of you. That can sometimes be people's experience of having Pluto in their second house. Conversely, Pluto in the second house can represent extraordinary amounts of wealth. How do we interpret this from within a chart? We have to see what the other testimonies are within the chart and whether or not those other testimonies stand in support of the wealth-giving parts of Pluto or the impoverishing parts of Pluto. So this is something that we need to be mindful of as far as Pluto in the second house is concerned. Neptune in the second house feels like having a toilet bowl within the second house, and if other things within the chart confirm it, Neptune in the second house can also represent us having a lack of money or us having a constant hole within our pocket. Uranus in the second house represents money that comes into our life quickly, but it also represents money that leaves out of our lives quickly. So Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, none of the three of them really represent an overwhelmingly good impact on our financial affairs, except for Pluto. But as I've just stated, the Plutonian thing can go either way. And we need to see if other things in the chart corroborate Pluto as a god of wealth within this lifetime or Pluto as a god of poverty within this lifetime. Now, for the 7 classical planets, Saturn does not belong in your second house. Truthfully speaking, the ancients would say that Saturn doesn't belong in any house. And the reason for that is because any house where you have Saturn located within your birth chart is going to be a house where you do the greatest amount of heavy lifting within this lifetime and the greatest amount of learning within this lifetime. And we would like to feel as if money was something we didn't have to do a great amount of learning surrounding. So Saturn in the second house doesn't naturally bode well in terms of our finances, and it says that money is going to be something that we do a great amount of learning and a great amount of suffering around and a great amount of finally coming to terms with. Money is going to be our greatest lesson within this lifetime. So we don't really like Saturn in the second house. If you could reincarnate again, you probably wouldn't want to reincarnate with Saturn in your second house. Similarly, the ancients thought that the Sun and Mars did not belong in the second house. And the reason for this is because both the Sun and Mars are hot and dry planets from a traditional astrological perspective. And the fact that they're hot and dry means that they burn a hole through your pocket, especially if they are weak. So if you have either the Sun or Mars in detriment or fall within your second house, then that could represent a force that burns a hole through your pocket as opposed to a force that actually makes you rich. With Mars, your money burns. With the Sun, you make a lot of money, but you also spend a lot of money, and so it never really feels as if you're rich at all, even though you might be rich. But with the Sun in the second house, it attracts bills that are proportionate to the amount of money that you find yourself bringing into your life, so it doesn't often feel like a good thing having the Sun there. The Moon in the second house is a point of fluctuation, and we don't really like the Moon in the second house because the Moon can represent a constant ebbing and flowing of our financial assets, especially if the Moon is weak. So if we have the Moon in Capricorn in the second house, it can represent a fluctuating of our financial assets in a way that isn't the best for us and in a way that doesn't actually make us feel the best, especially if that Moon is further debilitated based on aspects it's receiving within your chart, especially if the ruler of your second house is also debilitated. And finally, the South Node in the second house is just as bad as having Neptune in the second house, which is just as bad as having the ruler of your second house in the 12th house of hidden enemies and things we learn the hard way. Having the South Node in the second house, and really having the South Node in any house, quite similar to Saturn, is representing that that is going to be an area of your life where you're having to do the greatest amount of learning next to whichever other house you have Saturn in. And if you have Saturn and the South Node in your second house, then oy vey vey, you have lots and lots of learning to do, lots and lots of karma to burn as far as the topic of money and finances is concerned within your lifetime.